Hey guys, this is a video where we're going to learn how to classify neurons by structure and by function. So if we're talking about classifying a neuron by structure, we're classifying it based on what it looks like. If we're talking about classifying a neuron by function, we're talking about classifying it by what it does. So there's three ways you can classify a neuron by structure. You could be bipolar, you could be unipolar, or you could be multipolar. So these are the three ways you can classify by structure. And then here are the two ways you can classify by function. You can say your neuron is a sensory neuron, which means it's picking up data about the outside world or the inside of your body and bringing it back towards your central nervous system. Or it could be motor, which means it is carrying information from your central nervous system to the muscles of your body. So let's look at how we classify each one. So if you're in lab, you're familiar with this idea of how to classify neurons by structure. So when you're classifying by structure, you're looking at what the neuron looks like, and then based on that, you're giving it a classification as either bipolar, unipolar, or multipolar. So how do you classify by structure? You're asking yourself how many processes are extending from the cell body. So remember, this round part here in the middle, this is called your cell body, and this is where you find your nucleus and your rough endoplasmic reticulum. So we're asking ourselves how many processes are coming off of this cell body. So here we got one here and two here. So the number for two, or the prefix for two, is bi. So you can see a bipolar neuron has one process coming into the cell body, one process leaving the cell body. How do I know this info is coming in? They're dendrites, remember, which brings data into the cell body. And down here, this is an axon, which carries information away from the cell body. So your bipolar neuron has two processes, one in, one out. Now let's look at this next one. So this is your unipolar neuron or pseudo-unipolar neuron. It's more correct to call it pseudo-unipolar because actually these neurons start off looking like these inside an embryo, and then later the processes merge together to give you this kind of T-junction effect right here. So then it isn't really unipolar for its whole life, so we call it pseudo-unipolar, which means kind of unipolar. But you can see here's my cell body with my nucleus inside, and you can see there's only one process coming off of the cell body. So that's where it's got the term unipolar. Now, down here, these are my dendrites picking up the signal, and then the message is coming and being delivered down here at the axon terminal. So this type of neuron can be a little confusing because if you actually look at this under the microscope, all of this would be myelinated. So remember, what did we say our rule was about myelin? We said myelin is only ever found on axons of neurons. So if all of this is myelinated, then all of this must be the axon of the neuron, and only this little bit at the end here would be classified as dendritic, or bringing messages towards the cell body. So these are my dendrites, and then here all of this will be axon. So again, this is unipolar because there's one process emerging from my cell body. Now, our last classification is called multipolar. In this case, there are many processes coming into or leaving the cell body. So here's my cell body with my nucleus inside. And as you can see, there are many dendrites. Dendrites will be bringing messages towards the cell body. And then there's one axon. Remember, neurons usually have just one axon. So here's my axon carrying messages away from my cell body. So a multipolar neuron will have many processes attached to the cell body. So that's how you classify a neuron by structure. You're purely using what it looks like. Now, where would I find these three types of neurons? Bipolar neurons are very rare. They're only found in the special sense organs, so you will find them in the ear and in the eye. Pseudo-unipolar neurons is what all sensory neurons look like. So any neuron that's picking up a message and bringing it into the CNS is going to be a sensory neuron, and they're all going to look like this guy. And then any neuron that's motor neuron or interneuron, so actually 99% of the neurons in your nervous system look like this last guy. This is by far the most common type of neuron in the nervous system. So all motor neurons look like this, and all interneurons look like this. So they're by far the most common neuron. Now, you can also classify neurons by function. So function means what does it do? So in this case, we're interested in what direction is the impulse traveling. So sensory neurons' job, they are the afferents of the nervous system. Remember, afferents and approaching the control center. We learned about that earlier on. So your afferents are bringing your data into the central nervous system. So the sensory neurons are bringing data into the central nervous system. So they're picking up information from skin, from muscles, from your internal organs, and bringing all of that data back to the brain and back to the spinal cord. Now, the interesting thing about these sensory neurons is that the cell bodies are outside the central nervous system, and they're in structures that are called ganglia. So let's look at this picture. Here you can see a typical sensory neuron. So this is your skin, and these are the dendritic receptors here. So they picked up the signal, and then they're bringing the message back into the spinal cord. And later when we learn about the spinal cord, you're going to see that all messages come in at the back of the spinal cord, or the dorsal side of the spinal cord, or the posterior side of the spinal cord. Remember, all those words mean the same thing. So all the data coming in on sensory neurons is coming into the spinal cord or coming into the brain. And you'll notice that the cell body is here. So it's in this kind of bulge-like structure that's outside the central nervous system. In here where your spinal cord is, this would be classified as central nervous system, so it would kind of start right here when you come in. So you can see that the cell body is outside the central nervous system, and it's in this structure called the ganglion. So we're going to learn more about those ganglia later when we learn about the spinal cord. Now let's talk about our motor neurons. So if sensory is bringing data in, motor neurons are bringing data out. So they're bringing data from the central nervous system to the muscles. So they're carrying information from central nervous system to muscle. And remember, motor neurons are going to be all multipolar neurons. So let's look at these guys and see where they are. So here you can see the cell body of the motor neuron. It's actually inside the spinal cord. And then here's the axon coming out, and again, it's coming out at the front, or the anterior, or the ventral. Remember, all those things mean the same thing. So the data is coming out of this on this motor neuron, and it's going to your muscle. So motor neurons are multipolar neurons, and the cell body of these neurons is found inside the central nervous system. So that's a common exam question. Which type of neuron would have a cell body inside the central nervous system? It's the motor neuron. Which type of neuron would have a cell body outside the central nervous system? It's the sensory neuron. So here's some terminology that we're going to use, and especially when we start talking about the brain and the spinal cord. So there's a term for a cluster of cell bodies inside the central nervous system. That's called a nucleus. A cluster of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system is called a ganglion. So these are the same thing, a cluster of cell bodies. It's just the location that's different. So if you're talking about a bunch of cell bodies in the central nervous system, that is inside the brain or inside the spinal cord, you would refer to that properly as a nucleus. If you're talking about a bunch of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system, you would refer to that properly as a ganglion. So that's the cell bodies. So then down below here, we've got terms for groups of axons that are traveling together. So if you're in the central nervous system, a group of axons that are traveling together in the same direction. So think of it, you'd have a whole bunch of neurons, and all their axons will be going like this in the same direction next to each other. And that would be referred to as a tract if you're in the central nervous system. But if you're in the peripheral nervous system, you would would refer to that as a nerve. So people in lab are familiar already with the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. They're part of the peripheral nervous system. So in that case, we're talking about groups of axons that are traveling together to a certain area. So we refer to those as nerves. But if you have groups of axons in the central nervous system, they're properly referred to as tracts. So again, this is just terminology. You just have to memorize the name and the definition, so you'll know which is which if you see it in a multiple choice question. Okay, so that was the classification of neurons by structure and by function.